The air outside the cabin registered a temperature of 28 degrees below zero, a cold so profound it felt less like a number and more like a physical state of matter, a brittle, crystalline structure into which the world had been frozen. Inside Benjamin's small, single-room dwelling, the thermometer hanging beside the stone hearth read 33 degrees above zero, a difference of 61 degrees. He sat at his simple plank table in his shirt sleeves, a book open before him, the oil lamp casting a steady, golden light on the page. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the small fire, a fire composed of 3 modest logs that seemed to radiate a disproportionate amount of warmth. There was no wind whistling through the chinking, no frost blooming in the corners of the room, no cold seeping up from the floorboards. There was only a profound and penetrating stillness, a bubble of impossible warmth held against the crushing, absolute cold of the Minnesota Territory in the winter of 1842. 200 yards away, Theodore's cabin was a study in frantic opposition. A plume of dense gray smoke billowed from his chimney, a frantic signal of a desperate battle being waged within. He was not in his shirt sleeves. He was huddled in a greatcoat and a thick wool blanket, feeding log after log into a roaring, insatiable fire that consumed wood with a terrifying appetite, yet failed to conquer the chill that permeated his home. The wind, a relentless predator, found every microscopic gap in the log walls and drove daggers of cold deep into the room. He could feel the life being leached out of him, out of his home, stolen by the unyielding physics of the wilderness. He was surviving, but he was not living. He was enduring the moment, locked in a struggle that would last until the spring thaw, and he knew with a bitter certainty that he was losing. The stark difference between these two states of being, separated by only a few hundred yards of frozen earth, posed a silent, baffling question. It was a question that defied the shared experience of every soul in the settlement, a question that Theodore could not answer. It was the question of how. How was this possible? How this was possible was a story written in loss, observation, and an obstinate refusal to accept the brutal terms the northern wilderness dictated to its inhabitants. It began not with an invention, but with a death that had settled deep in Benjamin's bones and had remained there, a cold spot that no fire could ever truly warm. Before he was an innovator, he was simply a man, a practical and conventional man who had come to this frontier with his friend Samuel to build a life from the pines and soil. They, like all the others, had accepted the conventional wisdom of shelter. A log cabin was the answer. You felled the straightest trees, you notched them tight, you chinked the gaps with mud and moss, and you built a large hearth. This was the formula for survival, a time-tested method passed down through generations. And for a time, it had seemed sufficient. They endured the cold, they burned mountains of wood, and they told themselves that this was the price of independence, the cost of living free. They accepted the constant, draining battle against the elements as an immutable fact of life, as certain as the rising of the sun and the setting of the moon. They did not question the fundamentals of their shelter, only their own ability to execute the established design. If a cabin was cold, it was because the chinking was poor or the hearth was built wrong. The design itself was held to be sacrosanct, a piece of ancestral knowledge as solid as the granite bedrock beneath their feet. It was an article of faith in a land that was quick to punish heretics, and they were all devout believers in the gospel of the log cabin until the winter of 41, the winter that Samuel died. It was not a winter of unprecedented severity, not at first. The snows came early, and the temperatures dropped steadily, but it was nothing they had not seen before. The routines were established, the endless chopping of wood, the checking of trap lines, the careful rationing of supplies. Samuel was not a novice. He was a capable and meticulous man, his cabin a mirror of his personality. His axe was always sharp, his woodpile was always high, and his chinking was, by all accounts, flawless. He had spent the entire autumn sealing every perceivable crack, mixing his clay with hog hair and grass to create a dense, durable mortar that was the envy of the small community. On a clear, still day, his cabin was as warm as any, a testament to his diligence. But the wilderness did not deal in clear, still days. Its true nature was revealed in the storm, in the moments when the full, unrestrained power of the north was unleashed. The test came in the form of a blue norther, a storm that descended without warning, a moving wall of air that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in a single hour. The wind was not merely a current of air, it was a solid force, a battering ram that slammed into the north-facing walls of the settlement's cabins. It was a wind that did not go around obstacles but sought to go through them, its voice a high, keening shriek that spoke of an infinite and unforgiving cold. That high, keening shriek was the last thing Benjamin heard before he sealed his own door. He had seen the telltale signs, the bruised color of the northern horizon, and the unnatural stillness that preceded the onslaught. He had secured his livestock, brought in enough wood to last for what he hoped would be 3 days, and settled in to wait. For 2 days and 3 nights, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the wind, a physical pressure against the walls, and the constant methodical task of feeding the fire. His own cabin, built to the same specifications as Samuel's, groaned under the assault. Cold air forced its way through infinitesimal gaps, creating ghostly drafts that danced across the floor. A fine powder of snow grew in a line beneath the door. The corners of the room, far from the fire, were rimed with a thick layer of frost. He had to remain constantly vigilant, rotating his position, moving his blankets, ensuring the fire never faltered. It was a state of siege, a draining, miserable affair that frayed the nerves and chilled the soul. But he survived. When the wind finally subsided, he emerged into a landscape of pristine snow and an eerie, ringing silence. The air was sharp and clean, the sun brilliant on the new fallen snow. His first thought was of Samuel. He had seen no smoke from his friend's chimney for at least a day. A knot of cold dread tightened in his stomach, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. Propelled him across the snow-choked clearing toward Samuel's cabin. The snow was waist-deep in places, the drifts sculpted by the wind into fantastic, wave-like shapes. Everything was silent, unnaturally so. The only sound was the crunch of his own snowshoes. As he drew closer, the dread solidified into a grim certainty. The cabin was a picture of stillness. No smoke rose from the chimney, which was capped with a delicate crown of snow. The windows were opaque, covered not with a light frost, but with a thick, milky white sheet of ice. He called out Samuel's name, his voice sounding small and thin in the vast emptiness. There was no reply. The door was not barred from the inside, a small mercy, but it was frozen shut, sealed by a wedge of wind-driven snow. He put his shoulder to it, pushing with all his might. The wood groaned in protest, and then, with a crack of ice, the door swung inward, revealing the scene within. The first thing that struck him was not the sight, but the feeling. The cold inside the cabin was different from the cold outside. The air outside was clean and sharp, an honest cold. The air inside was dead, stagnant, and tomb-like. It was a palpable presence, a heavy blanket of absolute zero that seemed to suck the warmth from his lungs. The fire in the hearth was long dead, a heap of gray ash with a few charred ends of logs. A fine dusting of snow covered a third of the floor, blown in through 100 unseen cracks in the northern wall. And there, on the cot, wrapped in every blanket he owned, was Samuel. He was still, peaceful, as if asleep. But his skin had a pale, waxy sheen, and the frost from his own last breaths had crystallized on the wool of the blanket near his face. The frost from his own last breaths had crystallized on the wool of the blanket near his face, a delicate, tragic filigree. Benjamin stood frozen in the doorway, the reality of the scene washing over him. Samuel had not made a mistake. He had not been careless. He had done everything right, everything they had been taught. His woodpile, visible through the open door, was still substantial. He had not run out of fuel. He had simply been unable to burn it fast enough to counteract the relentless, systematic theft of heat from his shelter. The cabin itself, the very thing designed to protect him, had become his tomb. It had failed. The design was the flaw. Benjamin stepped fully inside, his movements slow and deliberate, driven by a need to understand that transcended his grief. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the brilliant, indifferent sunlight. He spent the next hour in the killing cold of that room, not as a mourner, but as an investigator. He ran his bare hands along the logs of the north wall, feeling not a draft, but a steady, uniform weeping of cold. The logs themselves were conduits, drawing the heat out of the room and transmitting it into the frozen maelstrom outside. He knelt on the floor and felt the same phenomenon. The packed earth beneath the floorboards was a heat sink, an infinite reservoir of cold that was constantly, silently pulling warmth downward. He saw how the meticulous chinking had cracked and shrunk in the extreme cold, opening up 1,000 tiny fissures for the wind to exploit. He realized the fire, for all its roaring fury, was an engine of its own destruction. The massive draw of the chimney, necessary to vent the smoke, was also pulling vast quantities of heated air out of the cabin. At the same time, it was sucking cold replacement air in through every available crack. Samuel had been fighting a war on 3 fronts: against conduction through the walls and floor, against convection from the infiltrating wind, and against the inherent inefficiency of his own heat source. It was a war he could never have won. And that realization changed Benjamin forever. Grief was a sharp, piercing pain, but this new understanding was a deep, resonant ache. It was the ache of a fundamental truth revealed. He had not just lost a friend. He had lost his faith in the accumulated wisdom of his people. The log cabin was not a fortress. It was a sieve. And in this land, a sieve was a death sentence. That day, standing in the silent, frozen cabin beside his friend, Benjamin's sorrow began to transmute into something else. It became an obsession. He helped the other men, including a grim-faced Theodore, bring Samuel's body out for burial, but his mind was elsewhere. He was replaying his sensory audit of the failed structure, dissecting its fatal flaws. The other men spoke in hushed tones of the ferocity of the storm, of a freak occurrence, an act of God. They saw it as a tragic but unavoidable event. Benjamin saw it as a failure of engineering. And a problem of engineering, he reasoned, must have an engineering solution. The obsession took root that spring. While others were repairing their own battered cabins, Benjamin began his work. He acquired a notebook and a stick of charcoal, and he began to collect data. He became a familiar, slightly eccentric sight, visiting neighbors with a mercury thermometer. He carried that mercury thermometer like a physician's instrument, a tool for diagnosing the sickness that afflicted all their homes. He was methodical, almost clinical. He would visit Theodore's cabin, or the homes of the other settlers, and with a quiet request, he would begin his measurements. He measured the temperature at the floor. He measured it at head height. He measured it in the rafters. The differentials were astonishing. On a moderately cold day, the air near the ceiling could be as high as 50 degrees, while the air at floor level hovered just above freezing. The settlers lived in a state of thermal stratification, their heads warm and their feet perpetually cold. He recorded it all in his notebook, pages filling with columns of numbers, wind directions, and firewood consumption rates. He noted how a wind from the north had a dramatically greater cooling effect than a wind from the south, even at the same air temperature. He measured the surface temperature of the interior log walls, finding them to be consistently 10 to 15 degrees colder than the ambient air in the center of the room. He was building a portrait of heat loss, a detailed schematic of failure. Theodore and the others tolerated his strange behavior with a kind of bemused patience. They saw it as an extension of his grief, a way of processing the loss of Samuel. "A man needs to keep his hands busy at a time like this," Theodore had said to another trapper, watching as Benjamin held his thermometer against a north-facing wall. "Let him have his numbers. It does no harm." It does no harm, they thought. But to Benjamin, the numbers were everything. They were the language of the problem, and he was determined to become fluent. His notebook became a catechism of cold. He drew diagrams of air currents, arrows indicating the flow of drafts he detected with a smoking cattail reed. He sketched the patterns of snowdrifts around cabins, noting how the wind scoured the ground bare on the windward side and piled deep, insulating drifts on the leeward side. This observation struck him as particularly significant. The snow itself, a form of frozen water, was an insulator. A deep drift could protect the base of a cabin from the wind. Yet their cabins were built to stand above the snow, exposed on all sides. They saw the drifts as an inconvenience to be shoveled, not as a potential ally. His obsession extended beyond the man-made structures. He spent weeks in the woods, not trapping, but observing. He watched the behavior of animals. He located a fox den, a simple hole in the south-facing side of a small hill. On a bitterly cold morning, he saw the faint vapor of the fox's breath emerge from the entrance. The entrance itself was not rimed with frost. He dug carefully at the earth around the den. A few feet down, the soil, while cold, was not frozen solid. It held a deep, residual coolness, but it was nowhere near the brutal, life-extinguishing temperature of the air. The earth itself possessed a kind of thermal stability. It was slow to cool and slow to warm. He found a bear's winter den, a hollowed-out space beneath the roots of a massive, overturned pine. The entrance was nearly sealed with a deep blanket of snow. The space within, protected by the mass of the root ball and the insulating layers of snow and earth, would be a stable, survivable temperature all winter. A stable, survivable temperature, maintained not by a fire, but by working with the natural properties of the environment. This was the core of the epiphany. It arrived not in a single flash of insight, but as a slow, dawning realization, the culmination of months of obsessive observation. Benjamin sat on a log, looking at the fox den, his notebook open on his knee. He had been fighting the wrong enemy. He, Samuel, Theodore, all of them, they had declared war on the air, on the temperature of the atmosphere. They built their wooden boxes and set fires within them, trying to heat the air inside faster than the wilderness could cool it. But the animals did not fight the air. They fought the wind. They used the earth and the snow not as a foundation to build upon, but as an integral part of their shelter. They did not seek to defeat the cold. They sought to escape it by burrowing into the immense thermal mass of the planet itself. The frozen ground he had always seen as an adversary, a heat sink stealing warmth from his floor, could be a partner. It was cold, yes, but its temperature was stable. The air temperature could swing 50 degrees in a day. The temperature of the earth a few feet down would barely change at all. The problem was not just conduction through the walls, but the wind's access to the underside of the structure. The wind, flowing under the slightly raised cabins, was attacking the floor, the largest and most poorly insulated surface. It was cooling the ground beneath the cabin, turning it into a permanent block of ice that radiated cold upwards all winter. The solution, he sketched furiously in his notebook, was to stop the wind. Not just at the walls, but at the ground. He had to connect the cabin to the earth, to insulate its base and anchor it to the stable temperatures below the frost line. He had to build not on the land, but in it. And this radical idea required a completely new approach to preparation. His focus shifted from the simple acquisition of building materials to knowledge. The following summer, he packed a mule and made the 2-week journey to the territorial capital, a bustling river town that seemed a world away from the quiet isolation of his settlement. He did not go to the trading post to barter for axes, saws, or iron stoves, the typical objects of a frontiersman's desire. Instead, he sought out a bookseller. The proprietor, a small, bespectacled man, was taken aback by Benjamin's requests. Trappers and farmers usually wanted almanacs or the Bible. Benjamin asked for books on Roman engineering and heat transfer. He spent nearly all his savings on 3 heavy, leather-bound volumes filled with diagrams of arches, treatises on soil composition, and complex equations describing the behavior of heat. To the bookseller, he was an oddity. To the men back at the settlement, his purchases would have been seen as pure folly. Theodore would have scoffed at the idea that a book could teach a man anything useful about surviving a Minnesota winter. Wisdom, in Theodore's world, was earned, etched into a man's hands by years of hard labor, not absorbed from the printed page. Benjamin also bought tools, but not the kind they were used to. He bought a heavy plumb bob, a long spirit level, and a set of masonry trowels. He bought a sturdy, iron-spoked wheelbarrow. These were the tools of a stonemason, not a woodsman. He was preparing for a different kind of construction, one based on principles and precision rather than tradition and brute force. He was preparing for a different kind of construction, and it began with a Herculean task that baffled his neighbors. He did not immediately begin felling trees for a new cabin. Instead, he spent the entire late summer and early autumn preparing the ground. He selected a new site, a slight rise with good drainage and a southern exposure, sheltered from the north wind by a thick stand of pine. And then he began to dig. This was not the shallow scraping of topsoil that usually preceded a cabin raising. This was an excavation. Using a pickaxe and a spade, he began to dig a trench, not just for the foundation, but for the entire footprint of his future home. The work was brutal, back-breaking labor. He dug down 4 feet, past the rich topsoil, through the dense clay, until he hit the layer of rocky subsoil. He was creating a shallow pit, a rectangular depression in the earth. Theodore and the others would stop by to watch, leaning on their axes, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. "What are you building, Benjamin?" Theodore asked one afternoon, his voice laced with a gentle mockery. "A root cellar with a roof? You'll be living in a mud hole come the spring rains." Benjamin did not argue. He simply wiped the sweat from his brow and said he was building a house. "I'm building a warm house, Theodore." The answer was so simple, so direct, that it left no room for debate. It was a statement of intent, and he backed it up with his unrelenting labor. Day after day he dug, loading the earth into his new wheelbarrow and moving it to a large growing pile nearby. He was moving tons of earth by hand, an act of sheer, stubborn will that commanded a grudging respect, even if the purpose behind it was deemed insane. This was the first step, the necessary preparation for a structure that would be fundamentally different. The structure would be fundamentally different from anything they had ever seen, and its construction was a slow, methodical process that unfolded over the following months. Once the pit was dug, Benjamin began the foundation. He hauled fieldstones from the edges of his clearing, selecting flat, stable rocks, and began to lay a dry stone wall along the perimeter of the excavation. This was a foundation unlike any other in the territory. It was not a series of piers or a shallow ring of stones to hold the first course of logs off the damp ground. This was a full 4-foot-high retaining wall, a solid barrier of granite and limestone set directly against the earthen walls of his pit. He used no mortar, instead relying on the careful fitting of each stone, a three-dimensional puzzle that required immense patience and a good eye. The inner face of the wall was smooth and plumb, checked constantly with his level and plumb bob. The space behind the wall, between the stones and the earth, he filled with sand and gravel, creating a drainage field to wick away any moisture that might seep down. This alone was a monumental undertaking. Weeks of heavy lifting and precise placement. The other settlers, accustomed to raising the log walls of a cabin in a single day with a communal effort, watched this slow, solitary progress with growing bewilderment. They saw a man building a fortress foundation for a simple, one-room home. It seemed like a colossal waste of effort, a misapplication of energy born of grief-addled thinking. The foundation was just the beginning. The true deviation from tradition was yet to come, the feature that would earn his project the derisive nickname Benjamin's Folly. Benjamin's Folly, they called it, and the name was cemented the day he began to build the wall of dirt. Using the earth he had painstakingly excavated, he started to construct a berm, a wide, gently sloped rampart of soil against the exterior of his stone foundation. This was not a loose pile of dirt. It was an engineered structure. He laid the earth down in thin layers, 6 inches at a time, and compacted each layer with a heavy wooden tamper he had made. He mixed the clay-rich soil with dry grass to help it bind, and he spent days hauling water. He hauled water from the creek to get the moisture content just right for maximum compaction. He was, in effect, building a man-made hill around his cabin's base. The berm rose until it was level with the top of the stone foundation, 2 feet above the surrounding grade, and extended outwards for nearly 6 feet, sloping down to meet the natural contour of the land. It was this feature, this low, wide wall of dirt, that drew the most scorn. "He's burying his own house before he's even built it," one trapper remarked with a laugh. Theodore was more direct, his skepticism rooted in a lifetime of practical experience. He approached Benjamin one evening as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the strange, earthbound construction site. "Benjamin," he said, his tone that of a concerned elder addressing a wayward youth, "dirt holds the damp. You know this. Every log you place on that foundation will be touching moist earth. They'll rot through in 2 winters. You are building a house of mushrooms and decay." Benjamin paused his tamping, leaning on the heavy tool. "The stone is the foundation, Theodore," he explained quietly. "The logs will rest on the stone, with a sill plate and a vapor barrier of birch bark. The earth will never touch the wood. The earth is not the foundation. It is the insulation." Theodore shook his head, a sad, knowing smile on his face. "Words from your books, Benjamin. Insulation, vapor barriers. That is not how you build a cabin that stands. A cabin needs to breathe. It needs to stand tall and shed the snow, not hide in a hole like a badger. You are making a terrible mistake." "You are making a terrible mistake," Theodore had said. And for a time, Benjamin felt the weight of that community consensus pressing down on him. The constant skepticism, the jokes, the pitying looks. It was a form of psychological erosion. There were moments, late at night, when he lay exhausted in his old, cold cabin, that he questioned his own sanity. Was he a fool? Was he desecrating the memory of Samuel by pursuing this strange, book-learned fantasy? Was a lifetime of frontier experience, embodied by a man like Theodore, wrong? But then he would remember the feeling of the air in Samuel's cabin, that dead, tomb-like cold. He would recall the numbers in his notebook, the irrefutable data of failure. And his resolve would harden again. He was not just building a structure, he was testing a hypothesis. His conviction, however, was a lonely burden to bear. That changed one afternoon when a young man named Lucas, a newcomer to the settlement who had arrived that spring, approached the building site. Lucas was in his late teens, quiet and observant, and unlike the others, he had watched. He had watched Benjamin's work, not with scorn, but with a deep, unspoken curiosity. He did not mock. He simply watched. Finally, he broke his silence. "Why do you pack the dirt so hard?" he asked, his question genuine, free of the condescending tone Benjamin had grown used to. Benjamin stopped his work, surprised. He looked at the young man and saw not a skeptic, but a student. For the first time, he explained his reasoning in detail. He spoke of the wind, how this earthen berm would deflect it, forcing it up and over the cabin rather than allowing it to slice underneath. He explained the concept of thermal mass, how the tons of compacted earth and stone would absorb the sun's heat during the day and radiate it back slowly through the night, moderating the temperature swings. He explained how the Earth's stable temperature below the frost line would act as a constant, mitigating the extreme cold of the air. He spoke, and Lucas listened. The young man's brow furrowed in concentration as he absorbed the unfamiliar concepts. He asked more questions, sharp and insightful ones. But what about the frost heave? Won't the ground swelling in winter crack the stone wall? Benjamin explained the deep, gravel-filled drainage trench, designed specifically to prevent water from accumulating near the foundation and freezing. Lucas nodded slowly, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. He looked at the strange structure, at the half-buried foundation and the massive pile of logs waiting to be placed, and he saw not a folly, but a system, a coherent and thoughtful design. "I see," he said finally, a single statement that carried more validation. Then he did something that no one else had. He picked up a spare spade. "Show me how you want the next layer spread," he said. "I can help." The offer was a turning point for Benjamin. The physical help was welcome, as his body was weary from months of solitary labor. But the moral support was transformative. To have just one person, one other soul, who saw logic in his madness, was a profound relief. It was the first crack in the wall of his isolation. Lucas became his apprentice, his ally. Together they finished the earthworks and began the log construction. The cabin they raised was, from the foundation up, a model of precision. Benjamin insisted on techniques that seemed absurdly fastidious to the old way of thinking. He used his level on every course of logs. He spent days carving perfect saddle notches that fit together so tightly they seemed to be a single piece of wood. The chinking was a special mixture he had developed, a combination of clay, sand, ash, and cattail fluff that, when dry, formed a dense, slightly flexible seal that was truly airtight. It was a truly airtight seal. Every part of the construction was geared toward achieving that end. He built a double-paned window on the south wall, a luxury unheard of, trapping a layer of still air between two small, precious sheets of glass to reduce heat loss. The door was not a simple plank construction, but was built in 2 layers, with a wool blanket sandwiched between them for insulation, and it was fitted into its frame with exacting precision. The floor was another innovation. Instead of laying planks directly on the ground or on joists open to the cold, he built a raised, sealed floor. The floor joists rested on the stone foundation, and a subfloor was laid beneath them. The space between the subfloor and the finished floorboards above was packed with a thick layer of dried moss and sawdust, creating an insulated barrier against the cold of the ground. He had created a primitive insulated crawl space, a concept so foreign that Theodore, upon inspecting it, simply shook his head and walked away without a word. The work was slow and painstaking. With Lucas's help, it progressed steadily through the late autumn. As the first snows began to fall, they put the roof on, a steep pitch to shed snow, with wide eaves that overhung the walls, protecting them from rain and melting snow. The final piece of the puzzle was the hearth and chimney, which Benjamin built himself from fieldstone and clay. It was smaller than a typical frontier fireplace, with a narrower flue and a deeper firebox, designed to radiate more heat into the room and send less of it rocketing up the chimney. By the time the first hard freeze set in, the cabin was complete. It sat low to the ground, its log walls emerging from the protective embrace of the earth, looking more like a part of the landscape than a structure imposed upon it. It looked solid, permanent, and, to the eyes of the other settlers, profoundly strange. Benjamin's Folly was ready for its first winter. Benjamin's Folly was ready for its first winter, and the wilderness did not wait long to administer its test. The early winter was mild, lulling the settlement into a false sense of security. Benjamin lived in his new home, quietly observing its performance. The difference was immediate and undeniable. The small, efficient fireplace kept the single room comfortably warm, with a fraction of the wood he had burned in his old cabin. There were no drafts. The floor was not a source of cold, but was neutral, even slightly warm to the touch. He could sit at his table and read in the evening without having to wrap himself in a blanket. He kept his notebook, recording the daily temperatures inside and out, the wind conditions, and his firewood consumption. The data was clear. The system was working. But the true test, the trial by ordeal, was yet to come. The community watched him, their skepticism unabated. A mild winter proved nothing. "Wait until a real norther hits," Theodore had stated at the trading post. "Wait until the wind blows for 3 days and the temperature drops to 40 below. Then we will see how his dirt fort holds up." The words were a prophecy. In the second week of January, it came. The sky turned a slate gray. The air grew still and heavy with a strange metallic taste, and a profound silence fell over the forest. The animals disappeared. It was the calm before the storm, a harbinger that every experienced frontiersman knew and feared. Benjamin made his final preparations, securing a small store of wood inside, checking the seal on his door, and settling in to wait. The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper, a gentle sigh of wind that grew steadily into a relentless, shrieking gale. The snow began, not as flakes, but as a horizontal blizzard of fine, stinging ice crystals. The temperature plummeted. It was a storm for the ages, a blizzard that would become the benchmark, against which all others in the territory would be measured for a generation. The storm would become the benchmark against which all others were measured, and for 3 days and 4 nights, it raged with an unholy fury. Benjamin sat inside his cabin, a quiet observer at the heart of the hurricane. The experience was surreal, a profound departure from every storm he had ever weathered before. The most striking difference was the sound. Outside, the wind shrieked and howled, a symphony of chaos. He could hear the tortured groaning of the great pines at the edge of the clearing, and the percussive impact of frozen branches being torn away and hurled through the air. But inside his cabin, the sound was muted, a distant, muffled roar. The earthen berm, now covered in a deep, sculpted drift of snow, was performing its primary function perfectly. It deflected the main force of the wind, splitting the current and sending it up and over the low roofline. There was no direct assault on the walls, no percussive booming, no high-pitched whistling through the chinking. The cabin did not groan or shudder. It simply sat, solid and unmoved, anchored to the earth. The silence within was the sound of his victory. He kept the fire small and steady, adding a single log every few hours. The temperature in the room never dropped below 30 degrees. He walked around in his socks, feeling the evenness of the heat, the lack of cold spots. The floor remained temperate. The window, his one concession to luxury, frosted over at the edges, but the center remained clear enough to see the blinding, swirling chaos outside. He ate his meals, read his books, and tended the fire, his actions calm and methodical. He was not under siege. He was not a beleaguered defender holding a desperate position. He was simply at home, warm and secure, while the world outside was being scoured clean by an elemental power. He felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, a feeling untainted by pride or arrogance. It was the simple, clean feeling of a problem correctly identified and effectively solved. He thought of Samuel, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a quiet, solemn sense of purpose fulfilled. This is the house he should have had. And as the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the contrast between his experience and that of his neighbors became starkly apparent. The wind died down, leaving a world transformed, buried under a mountainous accumulation of snow. The silence was absolute. Benjamin opened his door and was met by a solid wall of white. A massive drift had curled over the roof and buried the entrance completely. He spent an hour digging his way out, emerging into a landscape of blinding white under a crystal-clear, painfully blue sky. The air was frigid, the kind of cold that seared the lungs. He estimated the temperature was at least 35 below zero. As he cleared a path, he saw plumes of smoke rising from the other cabins, thick, urgent columns that spoke of fires being stoked with desperate intensity. A short while later, he saw a figure struggling through the deep snow toward his cabin. It was Theodore. He was wrapped in so many layers of clothing he was almost unrecognizable, his face gaunt and gray with exhaustion, his beard encrusted with ice from his own breath. He looked as though he had just returned from a war. He had come, Benjamin knew, out of a sense of duty, fearing the worst. He likely expected to find the dirt fort crushed by snow, or its inhabitant frozen, a grim echo of what had happened to Samuel. Theodore reached the cabin, leaning heavily on a walking staff, his breathing ragged. He stared at the strange, low-slung structure, half buried in a smooth, aerodynamic drift, and then at Benjamin, who stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, holding a shovel. The contrast was so jarring. The contrast was so utterly contrary to the natural order of things that Theodore simply stopped and stared, his mind unable to process the image. His mind was unable to process the image before him. Benjamin stood calmly, waiting. He said nothing, allowing the visual evidence to make his case for him. Theodore's eyes darted from Benjamin's simple wool shirt to the open doorway, from which a gentle, almost imperceptible wave of warmth emanated, a stark contrast to the brutal cold of the air. He looked at the chimney, which had only a thin wisp of smoke. He saw no frost on the interior of the doorframe, no telltale signs of a desperate struggle against the cold. Finally, his gaze met Benjamin's. The skepticism, the gentle mockery, the certainty of a lifetime of experience, it all crumbled away, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated shock. "Benjamin," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "How? Our fire, it couldn't keep up. We burned through half a cord of wood. The walls were covered in ice. How are you standing there like that?" The questions tumbled out, stripped of all artifice. They were the raw inquiries of a man whose entire worldview had just been upended. Benjamin simply gestured toward the open door. "Come inside, Theodore. Get warm." It was not a boast. It was a simple, compassionate invitation. Theodore hesitated for a moment, then shuffled forward, moving like an old man. He stepped across the threshold, and as he entered the cabin, he stopped dead. The feeling was the first thing that struck him. It was not the scorching, localized heat of a massive fire. It was a gentle, pervasive, room-filling warmth. It was on his face, on his hands, seeping through his many layers of clothing. He slowly, almost unconsciously, began to unbutton his greatcoat. He looked around the small room. He saw the small, calm fire in the hearth. He saw the book lying open on the table. He saw the lack of frost in the corners, the clear glass of the window pane. He ran a hand along the interior log wall. It was cool, but it was not the life-leeching cold of his own walls. It felt inert, neutral. He stomped his feet on the floorboards, expecting the familiar cold. There was nothing. It was just a floor. He turned to Benjamin, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning comprehension. "The dirt," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The dirt wall." "The dirt wall," Benjamin confirmed with a simple nod. "And the foundation. And the floor. It all works together." He proceeded to explain it all again, but this time, he was not speaking to a skeptic. He was speaking to a convert. He described the way the berm and the snowdrift had created an aerodynamic shell, forcing the wind over the top. He explained how the deep stone foundation, anchored in the stable temperature of the subsoil, had acted as a thermal battery, preventing the ground beneath the cabin from freezing. He talked about the insulated floor, which had stopped the earth from acting as a heat sink. He described the airtight construction that had prevented infiltration of cold air, turning the cabin from a sieve into a vessel. Theodore listened, his head bowed, taking it all in. The words from the books now resonated with the hard, physical proof of his own senses. He was standing in a warm room that should have been an icebox. He was a witness to a miracle of physics. He had built his cabin based on generations of tradition, and it had nearly killed him. Benjamin had built his cabin based on observation and a few leather-bound books, and he had lived through the storm in comfort and safety. The pragmatic elder, the keeper of conventional wisdom, was forced to admit a humbling truth. Everything he thought he knew about shelter in this land was wrong. He finally looked up at Benjamin with a new respect. "You did it," he said. "You solved it. You solved the cold." It was a concession, an admission, and an anointment all in one. In that moment, the pragmatic skeptic became the first and most powerful advocate for a new way of building, a new way of living in the unforgiving North. The pragmatic skeptic became the first and most powerful advocate, and with his conversion, the tide of opinion in the settlement began to turn. Theodore, a man whose words carried the weight of experience and respect, did not keep his revelation to himself. He told everyone what he had seen. He described walking into Benjamin's cabin, the gentle, pervasive warmth, the quiet fire, the man standing in his shirt sleeves after the worst storm in living memory. He spoke not with the shame of a man proven wrong, but with the zeal of one who has seen a better way. His testimony was irrefutable. The other settlers, who had all endured a harrowing ordeal, their own cabins failing them in varying degrees, listened with a new openness. The jokes about Benjamin's folly ceased, replaced by quiet discussions. The strange, half-buried cabin was no longer an object of ridicule, but a subject of intense interest. That spring, a change began to take place. Men who needed to build new cabins or repair old ones came to Benjamin, not with mockery, but with questions. They brought notebooks of their own, and Benjamin, patient and unassuming, shared everything he knew. He did not hoard his knowledge or seek to profit from it. He saw it as a debt owed to the memory of Samuel. He explained the principles of drainage, of building with the land instead of on it. He demonstrated how to lay a proper stone foundation and how to build and compact the earthen berm. He showed them the importance of an airtight seal, of an insulated floor, of a properly designed hearth. The first to adopt the new method was Theodore himself. With Benjamin's guidance, he spent that summer retrofitting his own cabin. He dug a trench around his existing foundation, packed it with gravel, and built a massive earthen berm against his north and west walls, the directions of the prevailing winter winds. The work was hard, but he undertook it with the fervor of a true believer. The following autumn, Lucas, now a young man with a family of his own, built the second cabin from the ground up using Benjamin's method, its low profile and wide, sloping berm a near-perfect copy of the original. The knowledge began to spread, one cabin at a time, a quiet revolution in architecture and survival. A quiet revolution in architecture and survival took hold, and Benjamin lived to see his principles become the new conventional wisdom. He never sought a leadership role or any special status in the community. He remained the quiet innovator, a man more comfortable with his books and his observations than with the company of others. He lived out his days in the small, warm cabin he had built with his own hands, a place of peace and security. He watched as the settlement grew, the new cabins that sprung up all bearing the signature mark of his design, the low profile, the deep foundation, the protective embrace of an earthen wall. Winters came and went, some as fierce as the one that had taken Samuel, but they were no longer met with the same level of dread. The fight for survival became less desperate, less all-consuming. The amount of wood each family needed to cut was halved, then halved again, freeing up time and energy for other pursuits. Life in the settlement became less about enduring the cold and more about living in the north. The cabins, built according to his principles, were not just warmer, they were healthier, free from the damp and drafts. Benjamin lived a long and quiet life, eventually passing away in his sleep on a cold winter's night, warm in his bed. His death was as undramatic as his life. He left behind no great fortune, no long line of descendants. His legacy was not written in a will or carved on a tombstone. It was written into the very landscape of the community he had helped to secure. It was present in the gentle, man-made slopes of the earth around each home, in the thin wisps of smoke rising from the chimneys on a cold day. It was in the quiet, unspoken gratitude of the families who lived in warmth and safety because of him. He lived in warmth and safety because of him, and the principles he had painstakingly uncovered through observation and personal tragedy, slowly, over the decades, became validated science. More than a century after Benjamin sat in his cabin reading books on Roman engineering, the concepts he had intuitively grasped would be given formal names by architects and engineers. Earth sheltering, passive solar design, thermal mass, super insulation, air-to-air heat exchange. These would become the cornerstones of sustainable and energy-efficient building. The simple, elegant logic of his design, born from the study of a fox den and a bear's lair, would be rediscovered by academics with sophisticated instruments and complex computer models. They would prove, with calculus and thermodynamics, what Benjamin had proven with a thermometer and a notebook, that working with nature was infinitely more effective than fighting against it. His physical structures outlasted him by generations. Long after the settlement had grown into a town and the original pioneers were gone, the stone foundation of his first innovative cabin remained. The log walls eventually succumbed to time and the elements, But the foundation and the gentle, sloping outline of the 2-foot dirt wall, the earthen berm that had once been the subject of such ridicule, were still visible, covered in grass and wildflowers. It was a subtle feature on the landscape, easily missed by the casual observer. Yet it was a monument to a powerful idea. His name was mostly forgotten, relegated to a footnote in a local history book, if mentioned at all. But his legacy was measured not in fame, but in the quiet, cumulative effect of a problem solved. It was measured in the lives that were not lost, in the winters that were not just survived, but lived, and in the enduring proof that one person's obsession, driven by loss and guided by reason, could fundamentally alter the terms of existence for all who followed.